Welcome to News from Neptune for March 1st in the 9th week of 2019. I'm Carl Estabrook. Our program is conceived in the spirit of Rosa Luxemburg, murdered by a social democratic government a century ago, who said the most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening. That begins by calling things by the right names, particularly in regard to socialism and capitalism. Our mentor, Noam Chomsky, says, terms like capitalism and socialism have been so evacuated of meaning that I don't like to use them. There's nothing remotely like capitalism in existence. To the extent there ever was, it disappeared by the 1920s. Every industrial society today is one form or another of state capitalism. That doesn't deny that state capitalist regimes that called themselves socialist made immense strides in the 20th century, in Russia and China notably. But since the last decade of the last century, our program has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, done in the spirit of Noam Chomsky. First on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Earlier editions of this program are available at archive.org. Chomsky says in the U.S. media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true and it will sound like it's from Neptune. David Green and I will try to say some true things on a War Party Wins edition of News from Neptune. You can deal if you would like, David.
Well, as long as you're talking about the War Party, why don't you have the first crack at the War Party,
okay,
if you want? And
what I had in mind there was the remarkable way in which it seems that the permanent government or the deep state or whatever people want to call the structures of American government and politics seem to overcome the somewhat inchoate isolationist impulses, the impulses towards peace of the chief executive, and made a bit of a mockery of his Hanoi summit. It seems to me that if anyone were looking at that with any sort of abstraction, it would be remarkable to see this celebration in Vietnam of two of the greatest crimes that the U.S. has committed in the last century, the war on Korea and the war on Vietnam, with millions dead. To see the American celebration of that with this meeting with the head of North Korea in Hanoi in Vietnam, and out of that would seem to have come an ending, at least, formal ending of the Korean War and a reestablishment of relationships in East Asia. That's obviously what President Trump meant to do, but given that Trump is perhaps the weakest chief executive the United States has had since the days of Calvin Coolidge, he was upended by the permanent government, by Secretary of State Pompeo, or by the National Security Advisor, and his deal with the North Korean government seems to have gone a glimmering. That's what I meant to say by the War Party wins. At the same time, I wanted to suggest that the War Party was doing very nicely, thank you, in arranging to kill people in South America with the promotion of war or regime change operation, call it what you will, in regard to Venezuela. The U.S. has tortured the people of Venezuela for a long time, but for the last two administrations particularly, and is seeming to be coming up to a military intervention if its attempts to overthrow that government and establish a government of its liking in Venezuela don't pan out. So it seems to me that those were the important things that happened this week, and instead we got our news media, as we laughingly call them, in this country spending their time over the foolish testimony of a two-bit grifter before Congress, and I was astonished at how close his testimony hewed to the approved political lines of the Democratic Party and the War Party in general. War Party is more than the Democratic Party. It includes the structure of the Republican Party, the neocons, the military, the intelligence agency, the intelligence community, etc. Cohen started his testimony by saying Trump is a racist. Remember that was the charge that the Clinton campaign came up with in order to avoid talking about any of the real issues in that campaign. Those real issues were primarily economic and social, the issues that made Trump president. And the only response the Clinton administration, the only response the Clinton campaign had to that was, oh, well, he's a racist. And it cost them the election, and it continues to be the case, I think. The bane of identity politics is coming home to roost in the Democratic Party and hurting them no end, I think. And it was interesting to see Cohen begin his testimony by embracing that point.
That actually gives me a good opportunity to segue into my first point.
We rehearsed. This is the way we rehearsed it, right?
We did this. We just perfectly well planned. Bill Belichick couldn't have done it any better. If only he could have gotten a hold of it. Robert
Kraft could, but he was busy, right?
Right. But anyway, a lot of inside football humor here. But anyway. I often refer to Thomas Edsall, the New York Times sort of think piece columnist, and an older man who's been writing for quite some time. He came to prominence during the Clinton campaign of 1992 with a book called Chain Reaction, which was about the sort of the emerging role of race in American politics. And he wrote an article this week in the New York Times called The Deepening Racialization of American Politics. He puts racialization in quotes. And the subtitle for this was, Obama was a lightning rod, Trump is a lightning strike. And then the other subtitle is, Democrats recognize, this is important, Democrats recognize racial discrimination more than they used to. They recognize it as racial discrimination gets less. In my words, Democrats recognize it more. And then he says, a Pew survey found that a majority of Democrats, after the election of President Trump, agreed with the statement, racial discrimination is the main reason why many black people can't get ahead these days, end quote. Republican views scarcely budged. So the Pew people have been polling on this question, or this agreement or disagreement with this statement about whether blacks don't get ahead in this economy, I think is safe to say, because of racial discrimination. From 2009 to the present, back in 2009, only 28% of Democrats agreed with this statement. Now, 66%, almost two-thirds do. Whereas during that same period of time, Republicans, where 8% believed it in 2009, 12% believe it now. So there's this group of people, this Democratic group of people, has really bought into the idea. More than twice as many, percentage-wise, believe that racial discrimination accounts for the status of blacks, where Republicans don't buy into this. Only about 1/10 do, and the question becomes, why is this question the question, or why is this statement the question? Again, the quote is, racial discrimination is the main reason why many black people can't get ahead these days. And if I'm asked that, I would say, why are you asking me that? Why do I have to why are you going to judge me as to whether I don't agree or do agree with that statement? That isn't the question. You know, this is what you're always referring to, Carl, when you refer to Thomas Pynchon. If you ask the wrong questions, you don't have to worry about what the answer is.
They don't have to worry about the answer.
They don't have to worry about them.
People are running the show.
Yeah. So this is just, it's just such an obvious case of setting things up so that people think about race rather than class.
Exactly.
Not to mention about race rather than war, race rather than, if you want to talk about race, obviously talk about it in terms of the war on drugs, mass incarceration, all that kind of stuff. There's lots of ways to talk about race without reducing our neoliberal era to that of race. And in fact, I would argue, I think anyone would argue, looking at what the data is, that racial discrimination per se plays much less a role in American society than it did 50 years ago or 30 years ago. But there are such overwhelming forces of economic inequality that include race. That is what we should be talking about.
Exactly. And the shift from one to the other was not an accident. The shift from one to the other, which essentially came about in the 1970s, was a result of the American liberal tradition, and I mean in the 1970s largely the Democratic Party, the American liberal tradition giving up that theme that it had been working on since basically the Depression of the 1930s. And that theme was the exploitation of the American population by capitalism. What we've seen in the last 40 years is a vast growth of inequality in America. Today America is a much more unequal society today than it was in the 1970s. A vast growth of inequality, and the cure for that, as the Roosevelt administration saw in the 1930s, was the programs of the New Deal, the programs that tried to take the edge off the exploitation that had produced the Great Depression. In the 1970s, the pusillanimous American liberal establishment gave up following that tradition, gave up the attack on exploitation that was, however, inchoately involved in the Democratic Party, and looked around for somebody else to take care of. And they said, well, if we're not going to try to challenge any aspects of American capitalism, we might look at aspects of American race. There was, after all, a major movement, a civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s that brought that situation to the attention of American liberals. The idea of finding a worthy group that they could champion looked pretty good to the Democrats, who had such a bad conscience in the 1970s of having given up the New Deal program. The result was a shift of emphasis of American liberalism from exploitation to discrimination. The unlooked-for result was the exfoliation of discriminated groups. A lot of groups looked around and said, oh, well, our problem is not that we're being exploited by capitalism, we can't talk about that anymore, but we're being discriminated against. One of the people who saw this problem most clearly was Martin Luther King himself, who said that the whole point of the civil rights movement would never be accomplished without an assault on inequality in American life. The peculiar side effect of this was to recast all American social problems in terms of discrimination, as you suggest, rather than exploitation. Walter Ben Michaels, who's written on this as well as anyone, said that was first noticeable in the terms even of poor whites in American society, who instead of saying we're being exploited by capitalism, began to say we're being discriminated against because they don't like people from West Virginia or something like that. Once you change that the nature of the debate, then the Thomas Pynchon observation applies. If they, that is the rulers of capital, the rulers of American society, the 1%, if they can get you asking the wrong question, they don't have to worry about answers. If they can get you asking about discrimination rather than exploitation, they're probably okay.
So Thomas Edsall, back in 1992, when he wrote this book that vaulted him to a fair amount of fame, Chain Reaction, that was during the Clinton campaign that this was published, or before Clinton was elected president. He writes in this book, he included several quotes from his book in this article to demonstrate the kind of prescience, which in a certain way he did have when he wrote this book, although it's not exactly the way, I mean, he's presciently wrong, not presciently right. He talks about, he refers to Richard Nixon and implies about the Southern strategy and so forth, and, quote, the fundamental conservative strategy of establishing a new non-economic polarization of the electorate, a polarization isolating a liberal activist, culturally permissive, rights-oriented, and pro-black Democratic Party against those unwilling to pay the financial and social costs of this reconfigured social order. So he's talking about Clinton becoming president, presumably representing this pro-black Democratic Party. But what does Clinton do? He gets rid of welfare with a lot of racist rhetoric that went along with that. He passes the crime bill with all the racist rhetoric, including Hillary Clinton's comment about predatory young black males and all that stuff. And then he wrote, and then his other quote from his own book in 1992, Edsall writes, quote, "At stake is the American experiment itself, endangered by a rising tide of political cynicism and alienation and basic uncertainties as to whether or not we are capable of transmitting a sense of inclusion, buzzword, and shared citizenship across an immense and diverse buzzword population, whether or not we can uphold our traditional commitment to the possibilities of justice and equality expressed in our founding documents and embedded in our, I have to laugh, and embedded in our most valued democratic institutions." I don't think Edsall is really that stupid.
No.
But he just has to buy into this line that the founding fathers created this inclusionary ideal, and that's threatened by well, currently Donald Trump.
It is quite remarkable when the fundamental question here is that people need money, and instead we give them the opportunity to advance themselves, so to speak, if they go out and work hard.
Yeah.
I mean, this is just silly, and if it were not backed by the entire intellectual and educational establishment of American society, it would be seen as silly, as a good bit of the rest of the world sees it. But that's the talk.
Yeah, it is when one sees the current. I don't want to downplay the racialized nature of economic inequality. When one sees the median and average income for black and white families, or for blacks and whites in this country, it is truly shocking, in the order of 5 or 8 or 10 or 10 times. And Paul Krugman refers to this as horizontal inequality in order to sort of downplay the general vertical nature of this. It's hard to find data on economic inequality among whites. I've looked for it, I haven't really found it, even in census data and so forth. So one persistently sees data about relationships between whites and blacks, and I'm not quite sure how to deal with that in terms of white poverty, but obviously it's there. Obviously, whites, given the essential growth in inequality between the bottom 50% and the top 10%, then one has to include whites, obviously, in that bottom. And, you know, we have to understand these things better in terms of these general trends. And that plays into the issue of whether becomes a sort of issue, and it's already emerging, I think, in the Sanders campaign, that does Bernie Sanders support reparations for black descendants of slavery? And this is a way to avoid, again, talking about general inequality, whatever the merits, whatever the debate we might be having about that. It doesn't meet the central point, and it's a way of changing the subject, in which the which is what the mainstream Democrats want to do.
I think that's true and important. And the debate about reparations, I think, is finally a dangerous side issue. We're talking about relationships to society as a whole. Reparations for crimes that were committed several generations back may not be the way to attack the present forms of exploitation and discrimination. And if you are going to do that, you probably should include the people who were exploited and discriminated against in the vast majorities of American society that does not have a history of slavery. It has a history of wage slavery, if you like, that produced equivalent misery in the American North as chattel slavery did in the American South. And the idea of making these historical corrections strikes me finally as a dead end, that what we want to talk about is the structure of society now, a way in which the fortunes of all can be raised by things such as universal health care, free education, housing, things like that. That's what we should be doing. And the idea of whether your ancestors qualify you for reparations or not seems to me to be a dangerous side issue.
Yeah, and one more likely to be raised by the mainstream Democrats, I fear, than the socialists.
I think that's true.
Ostensibly socialist Democrats.
I think that's quite right. You're watching News from Neptune. We're talking about the various circumstances that we find ourselves enmeshed in today. There are plenty of them, and the ability to see them clearly is not widespread. One note from our mentor Noam Chomsky on these issues seems to me worth bearing in mind. I thought of that primarily as a result of various discussions I've had with friends and associates where I've had critical things to say about the American political establishment and what it's doing and what it continues to do and what it's done, for example, to the approach to peace in East Asia that the Hanoi meeting was supposed to continue. I find myself reminded of Chomsky's notion that the smart way to keep people passive and obedient is to strictly limit the spectrum of acceptable opinion, but to allow very lively debate within that spectrum, even encourage the more critical and dissident views. This gives people a sense there's free thinking going on, while all the time the presuppositions of the system are being reinforced by the limits put on the range of the debate. That seems to me right. And it seems to me to be an example of why we have this Trump derangement syndrome that's going on right now. Whenever I have tried, since at least since the last presidential campaign, to talk about the major structural crimes of American society, people say to me, "Oh, you're defending Trump." Trump is the one who criticized these things in the campaign, and that nice Mrs. Clinton was cheated out of the presidency on the grounds that she stood for these traditions in American society. And I said, I have no brief for Donald Trump. I am trying to understand what's going on beyond the notion there is it's only a two-value system, plus or minus. You're in favor of Trump, or you're in favor of Clinton. There are only two possibilities. priorities here. And if you are criticizing the fundamental structure of American society, it must be because you're pro-Trump. Doesn't do much good for me to say, no, I'm not pro-Trump. I'm criticizing the principles of American political society. And Chomsky's observation about the convenient way to keep the argument going on within the limits of allowable debate seems to me to be apropos.
Yeah, and he wrote that even before Twitter.
Yes, exactly.
Or Facebook or any internet
Right.
things. But it's a curious week in which Trump, it's claimed that Trump wants to win the Nobel Peace Prize, but leaves Vietnam, having not taken the opportunity to have a more definite peace and denuclearization from North Korea. And I'm also reminded by an interview that the Real News Network did with Bill Black, the economist, the forensic financial analyst, who comments on all the criminal shenanigans of the ruling class, and especially the financial and banking class. And basically his argument that was, if Trump wanted to be popular, if he wanted to get reelected with an overwhelming majority, all he would have had to have done is make his tax cuts actually apply to the middle class. Or he didn't mention poor people, but I assume he, but what Bill Black pointed out was that out of the $1.6 billion of the tax cut, only about $1.6 trillion of the tax cut, only about 100 or 200 billion went to anyone besides the top 1% or the corporations, of which 1 trillion of that tax cut were given to. So Trump has all these ways of becoming a historic president. He surrounds himself with people, but he surrounds himself with people like John Bolton and Steve Mnuchin and Wilbur Cohn and all these other people. But then again, that's Donald Trump. So what do you make of it? What do you make of these choices about who he surrounds himself with, who he listens to, and what he ends up deciding to do? He's not a victim, for sure.
I think the more fruitful question may be, what is the American government doing, and what is it, and how can it be stopped? To talk about the American government and the policy of American government is to prescind from these questions about was there a deal with North Korea in the works and John Bolton arrived just in time to stop it. Yeah. That may or may not be true, difficult to know, but it ignores the major issue, that is the continuity of U.S. policy from the Obama or the Trump administration and before and as the way it looks, probably afterwards. American foreign policy is remarkably consistent from administration to administration. American economic policy is as well. The kerfuffle around Trump arose from the fact that he, in his peculiar way, said some unguarded things that made the American political establishment think that he really might mess around with the perennial truths of American foreign policy, such as Eurasia has to be kept down, peer competitors of the United States can't be allowed to arise in the Eurasian world. Russia and China must be combated all the time on the grounds that if they're not prevented by American war and war provocation, they will steal the lunch of the American ruling class, which depends in part upon the exploitation of Eurasia. Mm-hmm. Okay, Trump did say some things that sounded like that. The American political establishment went mad, went crazy in response. Nothing crazier, by the way, although they're capable of crazier things, than the whole Russiagate nonsense, to find a way to say that this sort of dangerous talk has got to stop. in Washington. Well, they've managed to stop the dangerous talk, and they stopped the dangerous talk in Vietnam this week with the in the summit between the leaders of North Korea and the U.S. They've won across the board, as far as I can see. But the important point, I think, is that this isn't new. Yeah. This is this is the way in which the U.S. has been playing the game, and talk about it that way is to perhaps minimize the millions of deaths that the U.S. has caused since it has achieved its foreign policy hegemony in the Second World War, and not be appalled at what our country is doing.
Yeah, and when one looks at the way Venezuela's been covered, it's obvious that when Trump is doing what the ruling class wants it to do, they're not critical of him.
Exactly. So, very good point.
So, that's a pretty easy point, pretty obvious point, really. There's so many sources we have about what's going on in Venezuela right now and what the U.S.'s policy has been. Nobody should be lacking in any understanding, but of course the mainstream media, the New York Times, etc., doesn't really deal with these things. Just one pithy quote from Ken Silverstein on his blog Washington Babylon. He said Ken Silverstein was actually one of the founders of the Counterpunch newsletter with Alexander Cockburn back in the day, whatever day that was. I think it was
backward in abyss of time.
Abyss of time, as you like to say. He says, "I just got back from Venezuela, and I'll be writing a lot about the country next week. Virtually everything you read or see about the country in the U.S. media is a lie. And to be clear, I don't mean skewed or misleading or incomplete. I mean a lie. For example, people in Venezuela are not starving. At least very few are, if any, nor is the country a dictatorship. But that's exactly what you would believe from reading the likes of he mentioned someone I'd never heard of, the likes of who he refers to as the atrocious Hannah Dreier, D-R-E-I-E-R, who failed upward from the Associated Press to ProPublica, that beacon of investigative reporting, obviously he's saying that sarcastically, and who has been a chief propagandist for the rancid old oligarchy. I don't know have you heard of this woman?
I don't know her.
Yeah, no. Right. But anyway, that's who he was drawn to. But you could say the same thing for anybody covering this through the New York Times, probably NPR, which I don't listen to, and so forth.
At the same time, we have the emergence of a number of political candidates, a number of Democrats who are putting themselves forward as candidates for the presidency, and the interesting attack on them has been their dangerous opening towards socialism. Trump attacks Bernie Sanders as a socialist, but then Trump signs the 2018 Farm Bill, where food stamps account for much of the cost of the bill, and launches a $1.5 trillion infrastructure bill. So in other words, the actual policies remain very much the same. The rhetoric changes. The rhetoric as our competing parties within the limits of allowable debate go after one another by saying, oh, there you stepped over the line, you've said a bad word, you said you're a socialist. And the whole notion of socialism being repristinated for American politics by Bernie Sanders may be the one real contribution that he's made. The fact that we're talking about socialism, even if we don't usually know what we mean by it, and if there's even though there's a great effort on the part of the political establishment to denigrate or to obfuscate the entire notion of socialism. Supporters of global free trade, globalists, corporate globalism, as it's called sometimes, do get a little upset when you start talking about socialism, because it implies that the worldwide economy should not just be organized for their profit, but it should actually be organized for the good of the majority, both at home and abroad. That's real heresy. That's very dangerous. And if that's what you mean by socialism, you better get out of here right now.
Right. David Harvey has been doing a series of podcasts on the democracy at work, sponsored by this group that Richard Wolff has been doing for years. But anyway, so David Harvey, the British-born geographer, Marxist geographer or Marxist anthropologist, as he's sometimes referred to, has been doing a series of very pithy, very well-done talks called the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, the most recent which had a lot to do with China and the manner in which China has entered on the global scene in the last four decades. I don't know of anybody who could put it in a much more sort of dispassionate, analytical, concise Marxist way in terms of where does capital want to go and what's it doing and how is that's been going on since China entered on the scene in the late 1970s. So I would strongly encourage those. Encourage listening to those. There's probably a total of three. They're short. They're relatively short, and so there's maybe 4 hours worth up now. But to harp on a basic Marxist socialist point, we have to refer, as Harvey always does, to the difference between the use value and the exchange value. And what neoliberalism has done is turn everything, especially including housing and property, but healthcare and everything else, into exchange values, whereas which instead of delivering goods and services to be used by the population in some social way, which could be called socialism, one delivers them for profit, which means that workers are exploited in this process. Consumers themselves are exploited in this process. And he puts things in these very basic terms that we should be talking about if we really want to make socialism mean anything.
And when we have any moves at all to try to reduce the growing inequality in American society and the rule of capital, the general construction of a society in which money rules, the reaction, the theoretical reaction is profound. Senator Ron Johnson, for example, says this week, our country is becoming more and more like a Soviet type of economy here. Commissars deciding who's going to be granted waivers, commissars in the administration figuring out how they're going to sprinkle around benefits, close quote. He's talking about the food stamp program. Now, look, the whole idea that this guy is a member of the United States Senate and is old enough to remember the word commissar and to suggest that the problem is that government agents are telling us how to do sorts of things with our money that they shouldn't be doing. We should be free to use our money as we want, and that includes, of course, Jeff Bezos as well as you.
Our commissars are people like Bezos and corporate CEOs of various kinds, hedge fund managers and so forth. Those are our commissars. They're basically deciding where the surplus value of the labor of American workers goes to, and a lot of it, of course, ends up in Treasure Island, in offshore tax havens, and places like that. So, yeah.
The range of potential Democratic presidential candidates have brought out some of the worst of these traditions of talking about politics in America, including the quite amazing attack on Tulsi Gabbard, the only one of the group who actually is anti-war in any way, including, unfortunately, Bernie Sanders and several of the rest who should know better. It's in fact Gabbard who is ruffling the feathers in the neocon dovecoat because she's actually talking about an anti-war position. None of the others are. And that's remarkable. The attack on the smears on Gabbard are not to be believed because she is off the reservation on on that other side of American politics, war. And the neoconservative concerns that are driving the foreign policy of the United States. I would be happy to see a discussion that actually took seriously what she has to say. She's pretty good on the stump. She speaks well.
I tell you what, unless people like Bernie Sanders and Alexander Ocasio-Cortez start to be a little more straightforward about Venezuela, for instance, in which their comments have been at best mealy-mouthed,
Right.
They're not going to get my support. I mean, Tulsi Gabbard would get my support based on what I know about her. I mean, I'm reacting partly to what you're about to deal with in terms of Barry Weiss, but there's nothing to make me like Tulsi Gabbard better than to read what Barry Weiss has to say about her. Barry Weiss is the young Zionist editorial board New York Times member.
Oh, we have a portion of Weiss's comments thanks to our chief researcher, Jeff Nicholson, who's himself, I think, a bit concerned about Gabbard. He doesn't think even Gabbard is, in fact, an anti-war
he
candidate.
has good reasons for believing that as well. Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But that's what we should be discussing rather than the nonsense that we get. Here is a piece from mainstream media on Barry Weiss, the Joe Rogan show. Barry Weiss says, so who's in the Democratic Party running for U.S. president right now? We have Kamala, Kristen Gillibrand, and Joe Rogan adds Tulsi Gabbard. Barry Weiss says, ho, 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 monstrous. She's an Assad toady, referring apparently to the president of Syria. Joe Rogan says, what does that mean? What does toady mean? If this is the level at which we're conducting debate, we have work to do, but still. Barry Weiss says she is, I think that I used the word correctly. Jamie, she says to an off-camera assistant, can you check what toady means? I think it means what I think it means. Joe Rogan responds, she's an Assad sycophant. Is that what you're saying? Barry Weiss says, yeah, that's proven. It's known about her. Joe Rogan says, like, what did she say that qualifies her, apparently as a toady? Barry Weiss says, we have to look. I don't remember the details. I mean, we probably should say that before we should say that before we say that about her. We should probably read it rather. Apparently, what she had said. Well, Barry Weiss says, I have read it. So we know who these people are. We can give the proper qualifications of anybody who should actually say something of a of an anti-systemic nature. Excuse me. I have a toady in my throat, I think, or maybe a frog. In any case, the discussion on this matter is proceeding in peculiar ways. Tulsi Gabbard was on the Tucker Carlson show last night and was saying quite reasonable things about the U.S. And war, and answering quite reasonable questions from Tucker Carlson. Now, Tucker Carlson, who's on the Fox News stable, who's in the Fox News stable, is supposedly a right-winger whose views on these matters can't be taken seriously by the American political establishment. But he's been saying some of the most reasonable things on matters like this, particularly matters referring to war recently. what they're doing here is dangerous. They're messing with that careful distinction between two parties working with, or two sides working with the limits of allowable debate that Chomsky was talking about. People are going to get confused if Tucker Carlson starts bringing anti-war figures on on his program and listening seriously to what they have to say. Good for Tulsi.
Yeah. And again, this is why I didn't react in the way I was supposed to react in that business of Tucker Carlson melting down last week when he had a Norwegian or a Danish or one of those Scandinavian.
Yes, he was Dutch, I think, wasn't he?
Dutch,
right,
okay, well, that's not Scandinavia. Okay, whatever. Anyway, that I don't want to revisit that. I mean, that just I didn't like the idea that was going to be used by people who are saying, well, no, you can't watch Tucker Carlson. Yeah. And you can't if you go on there, that if you're the kind of person that goes on Tucker Carlson, like you're Max Blumenthal or Tulsi Gabbard or whatever, then you're not one of us, and that just confirms our view that this red-brown thing can't work, exactly. And we can't work with libertarian, anti-war people, and all that kind of stuff. So yeah. Let me read a quick quote.
Okay.
Maybe not so quick, but Paul Street writes about the Chicago mayoral elections that happened this past week. Metropolitan, on Counterpunch this morning, Metropolitan Television reporting and commentary on the first round of Chicago's mayoral and aldermanic elections last Tuesday is another example of, we'll find out what. The local news teams were all over the spectacular failure of big money white male candidate Bill Daley, the son and brother of two legendary long-term Chicago mayors named Richard, to make it to the two-person mayoral runoff election in April. The story on local television Tuesday night was about identity, how the runoff election will be between two black females, Toni Preckwinkle and Lori Lightfoot, one of whom Lightfoot is gay. Lost in the coverage was the fact that each of the two final candidates can be expected to run Chicago's City Hall in accord with the commands of the city's leading corporate real estate and financial interests. Also not meriting serious discussion Tuesday night was the remarkable fact that self-declared socialists, actual grassroots opponents of the city's corporate and political machine, won in 2 of the city's 50 wards and made it to the runoff in 3 more. Democratic Socialist of America, DSA members, ran in 6 Chicago wards. They won flat out with no runoff required in the 35th Ward, Northwest Side, where DSA member and City Council incumbent Carlos Ramirez Rosa got 60% of the vote. And in the 1st Ward, North Side, where DSA member and aldermanic challenger Dan Laspada got 61%. DSA member Byron Sigcho Lopez won the top runoff spot in the 25th Ward, Southwest Side. DSA member Rosana Rodriguez Sanchez tied for the top runoff spot in the 33rd Ward, Northwest Side. DSA member Andre Vasquez won the second runoff spot with 20% in the 40th Ward, Northwest Side, where another DSA member, Ugo Okere, got 14%. As someone who has followed Chicago political history for many years, Street goes on, I have to say that this is a remarkable development. The city is poised to have more openly socialist city council members than any time since the 1910s, when Chicago voters elected several aldermen from Eugene Debs' Socialist Party. Quote, and he quotes here, just quoting Ken Griffin, anyway, quote, the oligarchs are shaking in their, he's quoting Ramirez Rosa. The oligarchs are shaking in their boots tonight, Ramirez Rosa told a crowd last Tuesday evening. The defeat of Daley, who spent $8.7 million, including $1 million from Illinois' richest man, hedge fund manager Ken Griffin, is just the tip of the iceberg. The real threat to the city's neoliberal robber barons comes from the bottom up in the neighborhoods, says Paul Street on Counterpunch this morning.
And the socialist threat, which is at all our throats, of course, takes a particular form in the Medicare for All agitation. Our researcher, Jeff Nicholson, sends us an account of the new Medicare for All bill. And the fact that it is a new bill makes the story important. The references to Representative Pramila Jayapal's, she's a Democratic representative from Washington State, H.R. 1384. You can't tell the players without a program here, and you can't tell the bills without their numbers. And it's worthwhile paying attention to them because there's a lot going on under the surface. The new bill for Medicare, supposedly for Medicare for All, H.R. 1384, Representative Jayapal's bill, is not actually published yet. It's still being worked on, dear me, in the Congress. So some of what we know about it is speculative. H.R. 1384, supposedly Medicare for All, has 106 co-sponsors in the House of Representatives. The former Medicare for All bill, the Medicare for All bill that's been around for a long time, H.R. 676, had a lot of co-sponsors. Well, but the Democrats never brought it to the floor for a vote, even when the Democrats had a majority in the House, a majority in the Senate, and a Democratic Party President Obama was in the White House. Even then, some Democrats, such as former Senator Al Franken, never co-sponsored what was known as H.R. 676 at the time. That is, the Democrats' support for Medicare for All was always lip service. Apparently, they chose to use that power to bring U.S. Obamacare, which, of course, remember, was Romney Care by another name, an HMO-written plan in which Americans would be forced to buy into an HMO-run plan or pay a penalty. The Democrats have been doing this all along. So the support, or the apparent support, the number of co-sponsors in the Congress means nothing at all. The Democrats could have established Medicare for All. When they had the power, they chose not to do so. What we got instead was a system, Obamacare, that favors the medical establishment. H.R. 676 was the opposition, or the alternative to Obamacare, favored by Physicians for a National Health Care Program who've been working for a single-payer plan, a Medicare for All plan, for many years. It's unclear why Bernie Sanders didn't make a Senate bill that was a copy of the text of H.R. 676 with a Senate bill number, or why this new supposed single-payer bill, H.R. 1384, needed to be written at all. And once again, the bill is not even available now for discussion because it is still in the process of being written. A recent Intercept article by Ryan Krim is basically an ad for H.R. 1384, the new bill, and doesn't give answers as to why H.R. 676 needed to be scrapped, why Sanders' Medicare for All plan exists, and why we needed H.R. 1384. There's also no mention of what the Democrats did with their congressional power when H.R. 676 was available to be brought for the floor of a vote. So the notion that what we've been getting from the Democrats all along is not a construction of Medicare for All, which is overwhelmingly favored by the American public, but rather an opposition to it, an attempt to forestall it by giving the appearance of supporting such a plan, but in fact not doing so. H.R. 1384, even if it should be passed by this Congress, and once again, we don't know what they're passing, would take at least 2 years to fully take effect. Within 1 year of passage, everyone under 19 or over 55 will be automatically enrolled. Everyone else can buy into this plan or stay with their current HMO. Within 2 years, everyone else will be automatically enrolled, but it's not clear why this is structured in this way. Every day some American isn't automatically enrolled is a day the HMOs can push them to not support the plan. Sanders' Medicare for All plan enrolls citizens in stages across 4 years, when Medicare came into being, the U.S. was able to enroll millions without the aid of computers. That was during the Johnson administration. So the structure, I mean, it's a very peculiar dog-in-the-night situation about the Democrats and Medicare for all. They're now saying, because of the overwhelming support for it by Americans, that they're working for such a thing. But the evidence is that they aren't. They're working for something that will look like it, something that may step in that direction in some small way, but won't do the terrible damage to the American medical establishment that Medicare for All would do, and by bringing the U.S. up to the standards that are taken for granted by countries from Germany to Costa Rica. And it's this sort of thing that the Democrats are working to avoid. Perfidious Albion, or perfidious Democrats, I think, is what we're dealing with here.
Absolutely, but you know, we're talking again about the transfer of health care from for-profit to socialized, from exchange value to use value. Nobody should be profiting from health care, and the Democrats are trying to sort of elide and finesse this movement in various ways. Another way is by talking about how it's going to be funded. An even more absurd tack in the sense that any proper nationalized single-payer health care program would cost much less than, more comparable to those in other countries who pay about half as much per capita as we do in this country. So last week I was going to raise the issue of modern monetary theory, which has been the background a lot of our debates about how to pay for single-payer health care or for the Green New Deal and so forth. We'll probably have to push that comment forward another week. It'll still be there, but there's been a lot of talk about that. Right. But suffice it to say that when it comes to healthcare, we don't even need to be talking about modern monetary theory or anything like that. We just need to be talking about how to take money from one place and put it to some other place and save money in the process.
Stay tuned for a discussion of modern monetary theory. And as David suggests, this is the background to an important debate that we should indeed be having. Happy birthday to Michel de Montaigne, who would have been 485 years old today. When he was 38, he quit public life to devote himself to leisure, reading, and reflection. He began writing experimental meditations he called essays. It was the old French word for attempts, and thus a new literary genre was born. The remarkable Sarah Bakewell, an author in her 50s, I think, wrote a few years ago a book called How to Live, or A Life of Montaigne in One Question and 20 Attempts at an Answer. It's a brilliant book with the same sort of literary flair that Montaigne showed in the 16th century and Bakewell herself shows today. In it, she maps out Montaigne's life against the questions he raises along the way and draws answers from the questions from his essays. After she published that book, she published another book that bears on questions that we often discuss here at News from Neptune, that in some ways was even more remarkable. It was a book called The Existentialist Cafe: Freedom, Being, and Apricot Cocktails.
We talk about that?
Yes. We do, actually, although the apricot cocktails probably hadn't been mentioned by name for a while.
Okay, all right.
We're more prosaic than that. We talk about a beer afterwards, right?
Okay.
Right? What, in fact, she was doing in the second book, and she's cleverer than we are, I think, in terms of making these connections, is the existentialist philosophic movement and its leaders: Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, Albert Camus, Martin Heidegger, Edmund Husserl, Karl Jaspers, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, people you might have read about in college, but would never quite the way that you would in the remarkable books by Sarah Bakewell. So Montaigne's birthday is an occasion for us to be able to recognize and recommend those books.
Happy birthday.
Go ahead.
Happy birthday, Michel Montaigne.
Indeed. Happy David's Day, St. David's
Happy
Day,
St.
for,
David's
to people named David, too. You've been watching News from Neptune for the 9th week of 2019, a War Party Wins edition, as the U.S. political establishment moves to overthrow by coups the elected presidents of Venezuela and the United States, as Presidents Maduro and Trump threaten to inhibit the economic dominance secured by violence of the U.S. 1%. News from Neptune is presented by Carl Estabrook, David Green, and J.B. Nicholson. It's produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Ethan Young, with Andrew Scollery. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere in The Tempest, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.